I am recording this session, and glad to see a lot of you here. And I thought I would start off with something. You may have tried this exercise before, but it's a nice way to kind of see how well you can do on something. So I'm just going to show you a very short clip. This clip only takes about a minute and 20 seconds. Okay, it's an example of a selective attention test, and so watch it very, very carefully. Okay, a test of selective attention. Okay. All right, let me get this up to full screen for you here. Okay, here we go. So just pay attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. Count. Sorry, it's not part of the selective attention test. So I'm curious. I wonder how many of you actually saw the gorilla. If you didn't, you shouldn't feel like you're unusual. The vast majority of people don't see the gorilla, and I can promise you that the link, which is on our slides, is in fact a real link, and there are no magic tricks in it. The gorilla was there all the time. But of course, in selective attention, what happens is we're focusing on something narrow. In this example, we were focusing on how many times people wearing white shirts passed the basketball. Yeah, and by doing that, we didn't pay much attention to anything else, and that's exactly what expectations do. Exactly what expectations do. So tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about expectations, and then I want to do kind of a little spin on expectations, and I, in particular, want to talk to you about what I find really interesting, what are called self-fulfilling prophecies. Self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay. So let me get started here. So this is the phenomenon I just showed you. It's called inattentional blindness. We tend to miss the occurrence of something that's unexpected, even though it's salient, if we're engaged in a different task. And you might think, well, that's just weird because it's just gorillas, and you know, it's okay, it's clever, but it doesn't really, you know, teach us anything. Well, let's try something a little different. What about some researchers who did a study where they wanted to find people who are expert at searching for something? They'd actually spent years honing their ability to detect small abnormalities in specific types of images. So they recruited 24 radiologists for their study, and they asked them to perform a familiar lung nodule detection task. See if you could find a lung nodule in these X-rays. Now, what they did in the study is they took a gorilla that was 48 times the size of the average nodule. That's big. And they inserted it in the last case that the radiologist saw. 83% of the radiologists didn't see the gorilla. And the eye tracking data, where they had actually tracked their eye movements, revealed that the majority of those radiologists who missed the gorilla had actually looked directly at it. But again, they weren't expecting it, so they didn't see it. And I don't know if you can see this clearly on the slides here, but if you can see kind of prominent. Actually, it's not that hard to see. Kind of prominent, yeah. So the bottom line is that our expectations are, of course, very helpful to us. They can help us make sense of things that would be difficult for us to understand otherwise. They can help us read text messages that, when in fact a bunch of the words are scrambled or just totally messed up. And that can all be very powerful. But let me show you yet another example here, okay? How expectations affect things. So this is a very controlled laboratory study. We'll talk about non-laboratory studies in a minute here. And who am I talking to here? I have no idea what's going on there, folks. Just a minute here. We seem to have a internet interference task happening here, entirely unintended. So let me do this here. All right. God bless them. All right, we're back. Sorry. Kind of stuff makes me crazy. Anyways, so we're back again. Let me get this up here. Good. So here's an interesting kind of laboratory study. Imagine you're looking at a computer screen, and you're asked to find a target. There are a number of things on the screen, and among the things that might or might not be on the screen is the letter T, although it could be rotated in any direction. The other things on the screen are simply distractors. You're asked to find the letter T. Now, sometimes it turns out that the researchers had set it up so that if you were paying attention, the distractors would have actually predicted the location of the target on some trials, but it wouldn't be true on all trials. And just before completing the task, the participants in the study were asked to sniff a cotton pad. On some trials, that cotton pad was scented. On other trials, it wasn't scented. The participants were told either that the scented pad would A, improve their performance, that is at finding the target rotated letter, or hurt their performance at finding the target rotated letter, or it wouldn't have any effect at all on their performance. It turns out that's exactly what happened. When participants were told that the scented pad would help their performance, help them find the target faster, that's exactly what happened. So they expected that the scented cotton pad would help, and it did. But if I had told the participants that the scented cotton pad would hurt, then it didn't, even though it was the exact same scented cotton pad. In other words, somehow these expectations are affecting people's performance on this very controlled laboratory task. Now, how might expectations affect us day to day? You can probably think of lots of examples. A good example was a study I saw a while back where people in a study were asked to taste chocolate. It was unbranded, though, so they didn't know what the brand of the chocolate was. Some were told that it was from China, and some were told that it was Switzerland. Well, if the participants had been told before tasting the chocolate, but not afterwards, if they had been told before tasting the chocolate, okay, participants preferred the chocolate they thought was from Switzerland. That wasn't true if people first tasted the chocolate, and then they were told that the chocolate was either from Switzerland or China. It didn't do anything at all. But people's expectations mattered. People assume that China from, chocolate, China, I don't know. We don't think of them as going together. So if I tell you in advance, you're going to taste some chocolate, it's from China, or you're going to taste some chocolate, it's from Switzerland, your inclination is you're going to like it if you hear it's from Switzerland. Other people who hear it's from China, they don't like it so much. That effect completely disappears after you've tasted it, because after you've tasted it, you've actually got the taste experience. Here's another example. In one study, people were given a dose of a muscle relaxant. I'm not sure exactly how this is pronounced. I think it's something like carisoprodol. I think that's how it's pronounced. But half the people were randomly told that this pill they were given was a relaxant. Half were told that it was a stimulant. They all took the same pill. The people were told it was a relaxant. After they took it, they felt relaxed. People who were told it was a stimulant, they felt tense. Exact same thing. In other words, people's reaction to the medication was being driven by their expectations. Athletes, we see this effect with. Athletes who were given a placebo, they don't know it's a placebo, they run faster when they're told it was a performance-enhancing drug. It's just a placebo. But if I tell the athlete it's a performance-enhancing drug, they actually do better, even though it's not a performance-enhancing drug. Those are all expectation effects. In fact, one study found that people who were adopting an exercise program and actively engaged in it, that their self-esteem increased only if they had been initially told that the exercise program would help their self-esteem. If they hadn't been told that, then the exercise program had no effect on their self-esteem. Of course, sometimes we don't even realize that we're communicating things. I'm going to share an example of this. I just literally read this afternoon, which happens to be related to tonight's topic. But let me just share this one. In one study, you've got people who are acting as jurors. Now, they're not real jurors. They're what they call mock jurors. So they're in a study. But they're watching actual judges, video recordings of actual judges giving jury instructions. And the verdicts reached by these mock jurors matched the judge's private expectations. So much so that it could tip the balance in jurors' verdicts. Now, this seems weird. How is that possible? Well, presumably it's because something about the way the judge has an expectation. The judge's expectation is somehow inadvertently, perhaps, being communicated in some subtle way to the jurors through the instructions, and it affects the outcome. By the way, there's a bunch of research about this in real jury trials. It's kind of fascinating and disturbing stuff. How about police lineups? I'm a big fan of the television show Law and Order, both the original Law and Order and Law and Order Criminal Intent and Law and Order SVU. And if you've watched any of those shows, when they have police lineups, usually you've got the stars of the show, the detectives, standing there with the person who's gonna look at a bunch of people in a lineup and try to identify who's the real suspect, right? But studies have shown that if a police lineup is conducted by somebody who actually knows who the suspects are, so they know who the person in the lineup is who's the suspect, that the rate of false identifications goes up 300%. And matter of fact, nowadays, in many jurisdictions, it's simply illegal to have somebody who knows who the suspect is be present in that room with the people who are trying to identify the suspect. Because we know that something about that third party's knowledge might creep in and affect the judgments of others. To make things even a bit crazier, if you ask people to putt a golf ball, if you tell people that the golf ball is lucky, they putt better. a bunch of studies on that. Now, it's clearly a superstitious effect, right? It's completely irrational. But it turns out if I think it's lucky, it somehow affects my behavior. Again, expectations affecting my behavior. A very distinct pattern showing up here. Here's something even more weird, a really subtle form of expectation. It's called embodied cognition. In one study, they got dozens of people. Some participants are given a cup of hot coffee. Others are given a cup of iced coffee. Both groups are asked to judge the personality of a particular individual. The people who were given the hot coffee judged that person, that individual, as having a warmer personality than do the people who were given iced coffee. Ironically, the people in the two conditions are completely unaware of the influence of the coffee being warm or iced on their judgments. As often happens, expectations affect us all the time, but we're often really unaware of how they affect us. Now I'm going to skip this next study. This is I want you to have a chance to read about it if you'd like on your own. It's a study that was done at MIT, and I'll ask you to go back and maybe open these slides and just take a look at it. It was done by Dan Ariely. And Dan Ariely created a brew he called MIT Brew. MIT Brew was just Budweiser with 2 drops of balsamic vinegar in it for each ounce of beer. That's all it was. And it'd be interesting to go back and take a look at this and see how it affected the the judgments of MIT students about beer. Okay. Here's another interesting example of expectations. Again, very subtle. This was a study done at MIT. Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral economist from Duke, he set up a station in the student center, and they offered students a free cup of coffee. So the students could come by, pick up their free cup of coffee, and then they'd be directed. The people giving them the coffee would point to a table out. That table had milk and cream and half, and white sugar and brown sugar. But in addition to that, it actually had cloves, nutmeg, orange peel, anise, sweet paprika, and cardamom. So participants could add whatever they wanted, taste the coffee, and then they filled out a survey. So over the next few days, the people running the experiment changed the containers in which the unusual condiments were displayed. That is, the milk, cream, half and half, white sugar, brown sugar, they were presented in normal containers. But on some days, the cloves, the nutmeg, the orange peel, the anise, etc., they were presented in beautiful glass and metal. Some days they were presented in styrofoam cups. And some days they were in styrofoam cups where the edges had been hand cut and were jagged, looking very messy. Turns out that the nature of the containers didn't affect anybody's interest in using any of those odd condiments in their coffee. In fact, virtually nobody used any of the condiments in their coffee. But it turns out that those containers, whether they were beautiful glass and metal or styrofoam cups with jagged edges, it did lead them to change their view of how much they liked the coffee. Turns out that on days when those odd condiments were available and they were in beautiful glass and metal containers, people who got free coffee liked it more. They said they'd be willing to pay well for it. And they were much more likely to recommend that the cafeteria should begin serving that blend of coffee, even though, in fact, remember, none of them are actually using these weird condiments. So why should the condiments make any difference at all if they're not using them? Nobody's using it. It's just they're in different containers. But there's something about the ambiance, of course, of something being in beautiful glass and metal versus jagged hand-cut edge styrofoam cups that made the coffee taste better. Is it possible that a really nice atmosphere could make coffee taste better than it actually is? Pretty sure Starbucks has been making a really good living off of that concept for at least 25 or 30 years. So, simple question: which would you prefer? Yeah. Would you prefer dining at Josephine's Catering, where they're offering delicious Asian-style ginger chicken and a flavorful Greek salad with Kalamata olives and feta cheese, or would you rather eat at Culinary Sensations, where there's a succulent organic breast of chicken roasted to perfection and drizzled with a Merlot demi-glace, resting in a bed of herbed Israeli couscous, and a melange of the freshest Roma cherry tomatoes and crisp field greens paired with a warm circle of chèvre and a fruity raspberry vinaigrette. Those descriptions on menus matter a lot, and they matter because they affect our expectations. I'm always surprised that diners haven't figured this out, but I guess they haven't. So here's kind of the last thing I want to talk about briefly about expectations before I go on to talk about self-fulfilling prophecies. In taste tests, when Pepsi ran taste tests, they found that people preferred Pepsi to Coke. When Pepsi ran taste tests, they were blind taste tests. That is, the people drinking the beverages didn't know whether they were drinking Pepsi or Coke. And in those studies, people preferred Pepsi to Coke. When Coke ran taste tests, people preferred Coke to Pepsi. Their taste tests were not blind, though. Consumers could see whether they were drinking Coke or Pepsi. So here's an interesting little study. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but worth reminding you of. One interesting way to think about what's happening with people's brains in these circumstances is to put people in a functional MRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. These are machines that take images very, very rapidly and can enable researchers to study brain activity levels. So different participants, they all get slid into the machine, and they're going to receive a drink while they're in the machine. They get it like a straw, and they're presented with some visual information before the drink arrives. And the visual information is either that Coke is on its way, or Pepsi's on its way, or an unknown drink is on its way. And the researchers observed the brain activity of the participants when they drank Coke, knowing it was Coke, Pepsi, knowing it was Pepsi, and when they didn't even know what they were going to be drinking. It turns out that the brain activation of the participants was different depending on whether the name of the drink was revealed in advance. So whenever they got Coke or Pepsi, they knew one or the other was coming. A particular brain center, no need to even think about anything that's technical, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, that was stimulated. That's an area of the brain that's associated with emotional connections. Okay? But when they were getting Coke, in addition to that, another area of the brain was involved. This is an area of the brain associated with higher order cognitions. It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. And that was also strongly activated. And so this is a kind of an area where no matter whether you're getting Coke or Pepsi, this kind of thing about feeling is stimulated. And that happens for both of them. And that's mainly that people are having a positive reaction to anticipating the sugar, although they're not obviously thinking of it that way. But when they thought Coke was coming, the presence of the name of Coke activated higher order brain mechanisms. That's a great example of a branding effect due to expectations. It's a branding effect due to expectations. I have a positive, and many people do have a higher positive connotation associated with Coke than they do with Pepsi. I don't, by the way. I have a choice. I always order Pepsi, but I'm not most people. So it turns out that everybody, when they know Coke or Pepsi is happening, about to get it, certain areas are stimulated that are associated with that the basic hedonic value, emotional value of the drink. But when it's Coke, some higher order brain activity is going on, and that's what's explaining why more people tended to react favorably when it was the taste test was not blind. If they knew it was Coke, in my first example, then that has a positive effect. Yeah, and that's because this higher order brain activity is involved. Sticking with the idea of drinks, I don't know how many of you drink vodka. So I want to give you a quick. I love this definition of vodka. According to the U.S. government, it's a neutral spirit that is distilled, quote, as to be without distinctive character, aroma, taste, or color, unquote. And I don't mean to depress those of you who are fans of vodka, but most vodkas actually originate with agrochemical suppliers like Archer Daniels Midland. And then the vodka distiller takes what essentially is a 190 proof industrial swill and subtracts as much taste as possible from it. That's what the distillation process does. But through expensive image building campaigns, vodka producers have managed to create very strong expectations that different vodkas taste really differently. And as a result, most people believe that vodka, which by the way, again, by its definition has no distinctive character, varies a great deal from brand to brand. Some brands are way better than others, and I can tell the difference. And people are willing to pay large amounts of money based on those brand differences. Now, if you're not convinced of this, why don't you try it yourself? Get a bunch of vodkas and get some friends over and perform a blind taste test and see if people can tell what's going on. The New York Times actually did that a number of years back. And it turns out without labels, other very expensive brands, Grey Goose and other expensive brands, they didn't do so well at all without labels in these blind taste tests. In fact, the results appeared to be almost random. In fact, the brand that wound up getting the highest preference was Smirnoff, which is a pretty cheap bar brand, actually. But of course, that's because they're blind. So our expectations are involved in lots of stereotypes. I'm going to talk about one in a minute when I switch to self-fulfilling prophecies here. But there's lots of stuff there. We expect older people are going to need help using a computer. We expect Harvard students to be smart. And an incredibly fascinating study, I think at least, involved how sometimes we stereotype ourselves. We have expectations about ourselves. And those expectations, it turns out, can be affected by how we identify ourselves. So here's an example. A stereotype of Asian Americans is that they're good at math and science. Just arguing that's a stereotype. There's plenty of evidence that that stereotype exists. A stereotype of females is that they're not very good at math. What if you're an Asian American female? Well, here's what they did in this study. Great study. It's on, by the way, this study's online and I'll on Canvas, and I'll talk about why in a minute. They recruited dozens of Asian American women to take a math exam. Math exam with objectively correct or wrong answers. These Asian American women were randomly assigned to two groups. Before taking the math test, some of the women were asked questions that would likely make them think about their gender. So, for example, they'd ask several questions. One of the questions might be about, what do you think of co-ed dorms? So if you're thinking about co-ed dorms, that kind of brings up gender. That might make the Asian American women think about their own gender. But these Asian American women in another group, again, assigned at random, before they did the math test, they were asked questions that would kind of draw attention to their race. For example, they might ask, how many languages do you know? Or how many languages were spoken in the home that you grew up in. And again, that might make you think about what your race is, that you're Asian. So now everybody goes and they take the math test. Again, they've been completely randomly assigned to these two conditions. There's no reason to think that one group would do better or worse than the other. And what happens? Well, Asian American women who'd been prompted, and really completely unaware of this prompting, to think about their gender, they didn't do as well on the math test as Asian American women who'd been prompted to think about their race. And again, neither group was really aware of this effect or what was going on, but it mattered. When Asian American women were thinking about their race, they did better at math than when they were thinking about their gender. And by the way, while I'm on this, can I just quickly mention something? I don't want to leave you with any misapprehensions here. There's no evidence at all that men are generally better at math than women. So if you're holding on to that stereotype, please get rid of it. There's no compelling evidence that it's true at all. If you want more information about it, please let me know, and I'll be happy to talk about it with you. So despite the fact that some people might think that men are actually better at math than women, it's just not true. All right, so we've been talking for about 33 minutes, and I want to spend the last 10 minutes talking about self-fulfilling prophecies. So here's another study that is also on Canvas. This is a study conducted by a guy named Dov Eden in the Israeli army. So I can't emphasize the real-world nature of this study. The study involved 105 Israeli soldiers, and they were entering a 15-week commander training program. Unsurprisingly, this is a grueling program in the Israeli army. Before the classes started, Dov Eden and his colleagues told the people who would be training, these 105 people, that each of the 105 soldiers had been designated as having a command potential based on previous testing and performance. They said that each one of these 105 soldiers had been designated as either having high command potential, regular command potential, or unknown command potential, because they simply didn't have enough information to make that judgment. Now, I want to emphasize something here. They didn't say that any of the soldiers had low command potential. That would have been crazy. Obviously, there's no way that the Israeli army would have had soldiers going through a command training program who'd been designated as having low command potential. So the trainers are told that each soldier was either high command potential, regular command potential, unknown command potential. Then each trainer was given the list of people they're going to work with. So I forget, 15 people or something like that, and maybe 20 or something. And they were told, okay, here's the command potential of the 20 people. So each of the 20 people would have a different command potential, right? Some high, some regular, some unknown. And the instructors, the trainers, were told to write down, high, regular, or unknown next to each person's name. That's it. Now, the key thing to understand at this point is that the entire story about command potential had been made up by Dov Eden and his colleagues. The Israeli army senior people knew that this was going on, but the trainers didn't know it, and the soldiers didn't know it. Matter of fact, the soldiers didn't even know they'd ever been designated as having any kind of command potential, but the trainers thought of their students as either having high, regular, or unknown command potential. So then the training goes on, and 15 weeks later, at the end, the end of the training, all 105 soldiers take a test, several tests actually. Some of the tests were, they were all objective, by the way. Some of them involved their knowledge of combat practices. Some involved their knowledge of topography, some navigation, some weapons firing, some involved standard operating procedures. And I want to emphasize, when these soldiers took these tests, all of the tests were scored by people other than the trainers. So the trainers were the only ones who knew their supposed command potential, even though that had been completely made up. They were just completely assigned at random to that. But so the trainers do that, but the people who were scoring their actual performance objectively, they didn't know any of that. But here's what happened. The soldiers whose trainers had been told that they had high command potential, they scored much better at the end of the training, 22% higher than those people who had those soldiers who had been designated as having regular or unknown command potential. It's really striking. How the hell did that happen? Remember, you can't say this is due to bias on the part of the people who were scoring them. At the end, the people who were scoring them had no idea what was going on. And they were just objectively scoring what happened. They didn't know anything about command potential. This is an example of what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are labeled in the workplace, and they often come to take on the characteristics of the label. Notice that it's not just that the trainers thought that they were going to be better because I thought these people had high command potential, and so I somehow was biased in scoring them. The trainers weren't scoring them. Other people were judging them. That is to say, the soldiers were now behaving in a way that was consistent with the expectations of the trainers. And why does that happen? Well, it happens because, and they did nice pieces of this study to illustrate this effect, trainers treated people differently based on the label that had been given to the person. So when trainers thought somebody had high command potential, it turns out when you ask the soldiers afterwards questions like, well, how much time did your trainer spend with you? How many challenging assignments did your trainer give to you? How encouraging was your trainer? How demanding was your trainer? Etc. And it turns out that those who had been designated as having high command potential, they saw their trainers as more supportive, more challenging, more demanding, having higher expectations of them than did those soldiers who just had been labeled as having regular command potential or unknown command potential. In essence, the trainers were treating people differently based on their expectations, and that led the soldiers to actually come to behave in a way that was consistent with those initial labels. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. These self-fulfilling prophecies have been demonstrated multiple times in workplaces, in many peer-refereed studies in very good journals, and they can work both ways, both in a positive way and in a negative way. So, in our closing 5 minutes, I will tell you about one of my favorite studies done many years ago at the University of Minnesota. 51 women and men signed up for a study on communication. They were all undergrad students. They were all in their first kind of intro psych class. Literally thousands of people take this class. Often 1,500 or so take these classes. Yeah. Really interesting. And the men were randomly paired with women. And they're told you're going to get a short phone conversation and just chit chat. And that we're going to record this. It's just a study about communication. And the men actually never meet the women face to face. That never happens. Okay? Each man received a biographical sketch about the woman he'd be talking to before he was talking to the woman. And he received a photo of her. This wasn't true for the women, but it was true for the men. Now, the little biographical sketches were, in fact, accurate. They actually based on information that the women had provided. But the photos weren't accurate. The photos were of completely different women. In fact, the researchers, before the study had gone on, had arranged to get a bunch of different photos. And some of the photos were of very attractive women, really good-looking women. And some of them were of very average women. Not bad-looking women by any means, just average. And these photos were just randomly assigned. Right? So think of this situation now. These 51 men think they're talking to a woman, and it's just a study. We're going to have a conversation on the phone. It's going to be video. It's going to be audio recorded. But half of the men think they're talking to a woman who's really, really good looking, and half of them think they're talking to a woman who's average looking. So what do you think happened? Now, the first part of this won't surprise you at all, of course. Okay? So after they're done with the conversation, the men complete an impression questionnaire, and they're asked to rate what they think the woman they were just talking to would be like. Now, of course, there's no surprise here. Everybody knows this by the time you're 8. Yeah. So if the photo that the men had been given was of an exceptionally pretty woman, then the men expected that this would be a sociable, poised, funny, socially skillful woman. But if the photos were ordinary, the men expected those women to be more awkward or more serious or perhaps even socially inept. Now, there's nothing surprising about that. That's just basic physical appearance effects on men and women. By the way, please don't think this only happens with men judging women. It happens with women judging men as well. Well established. So here's what happened. Remember, I told you that the researchers recorded the phone calls. So they took the recordings of the 51 phone calls. They edited out the man's voice. So the only thing now left on the recording was the woman's voice. And they played those 51 recordings to other people who had not been part of the study at all. So they asked them to listen to the 51 recordings, listen to the woman's voice, and when you're done listening to the woman's voice, I'm going to ask you to fill out a questionnaire about what you think this woman would be like. Okay? These were just ordinary folks, ordinary students, men and women. They didn't know anybody. Let me emphasize, they knew nothing about the photos. All they're doing is listening to the woman's voice. Remember, the woman was talking to a man who either thought the woman was extremely attractive or average looking. But the people who are now listening to the woman's voice don't know any of that. After they listen to the woman's voice, they're asked to judge the qualities of that woman. Stunningly enough, those people who know nothing about what's going on, when they're listening to a woman who had been talking to a man who thought the woman was extremely attractive, they judge that woman to be socially skillful, interesting, somebody who'd be good to talk to, they'd like to spend time with, they'd like to get to know that person. That doesn't occur when they're listening to women who are talking to men who thought they were ordinary. In essence, the people who knew nothing about the study at all, knew nothing about the photos, nothing at all about the women at all they knew was that they were listening to voices of women who were talking to men. That was it. The men's voices had been removed. And if it turns out that the voice they were listening to was a woman who was talking to a man who thought that person was really attractive, then neutral people who knew nothing about it at all also judged that person to be interpersonally skillful, attractive, interesting, etc. In essence, what happened? It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here's how it works. The man, back in the earlier phase, believes he's talking to an attractive woman. Like most guys, if you're talking to an attractive woman, or at least you think it's an attractive woman, you're going out of your way to not be a jerk. For most of us, that's really hard to do, by the way, but at least you're going out of your way. So you're asking questions, you're showing a lot of interest, your voice is modulated, you're like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that, So all this is happening in this conversation. The men are really treating these women a certain way based on their impression that the woman's really attractive. Of course, the women don't know what's going on. So as far as they know, they're talking to somebody who's really nice and interesting. So the women behave in kind. That is to say, they respond by being interesting and sociable and engaging and having a good sense of humor. But when women were talking to a guy who actually thought the woman was just kind of ordinary, kind of plain looking, average looking, then that guy's not working as hard, right, to try to make a great impression. Hey, we're in an experiment. Yeah, okay. So, hey, what you doing? Yeah, what's your major? Okay. It's interesting. Yeah, where you from? So, and of course the woman responds in kind, right? This guy seems kind of boring, not very interesting. So they don't respond in any engaging or interesting way themselves. In essence, the male's expectations affected the way the male behaved toward the women. And the women behaved in a way that was consistent with the male's expectations, just the way the Israeli soldiers behaved in a way that was consistent with the expectations of the trainers, and even neutral observers could detect it. That's what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want you to think about this a little bit because I have a really strong bet that every single one of you has probably benefited from and been hurt by at some point in your life a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that you have had a self-fulfilling prophecy. You hire somebody, you think this person's going to be really good, you interviewed them, think they're going to be really good, and it turns out that months later your initial prophecy turns out to be true. They really are doing very, very well. And you attribute that, of course, to the fact that you were a really good judge of character. But maybe you weren't. Maybe it was just your expectation. You had a very high expectation of this person. You treated them really well. You were very supportive. You gave them challenging work. You provided coaching. You made sure they had plenty of developmental opportunities, lots of guidance, got help from other mentors in the organization. And 6 or 12 months later, the person's doing great. It's not because of it's not because of what your initial expectation was. It's because you began to treat them differently, and they become in a way that fulfills your initial expectations. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want to remind you that one of your assignments for this course is to write a summary of several research articles. Now, the information about that assignment, of course, is posted on the assignments page. The articles are posted on Canvas. 2 of the articles that we discussed tonight are among those that you can use. Okay? One of them was the article about Asian American women, and one of them was the article about the Israeli soldiers. If you have any questions about those articles, let me know, but I don't want you to just ignore them because they are potential sources for that assignment, which is coming up. So that's kind of brings us pretty much to the end of where we're at here, and I just want to really quickly kind of get your sense of where we're at here. So if you can just give me a feel on expectations and self-fulfilling prophecies. Interesting? Surprising? Or just boring? I knew it all along. Let's wait and give everybody a chance to check in. We got 13 people here. Let's see what everybody has to say. Okay, looks like we got everybody here. Good. So, everybody either agreed or strongly agreed that the information was interesting, with the majority of people picking strongly agree. I'm glad you found it that way. I find this to be a really interesting topic. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week, and we're going to do something totally different next week than what we've been doing. And again, we'll try to change it up every week so it's completely different. Hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope you all enjoy the really good weather that's in front of us for the next few days, and you all have a great week. Thanks so much.